Today on The State of Us, how to judge Thomas Jefferson and other founders. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by the one and only, our senior resident historian and the friendly redneck liberal, Mr. Lance Jackson. Today, we're looking at understanding the author of the Declaration of Independence, what it means wrestling with his contradictory legacies as a visionary, egalitarian, and a slaveholder. This is from a review piece entitled What Remains of Thomas Jefferson in the Wall Street Journal. To talk about the contradictory feelings and statements about how what he's written is woven into the fabric of American society, but more broadly to discuss how to view our founders in the modern era. Before we dive into that, though, Lance, do we have a word of the day?
We do. We're going to do some exegesising today.
Yeah?
Exegesis. Mm-hmm. E-X-E-G-E-S-I-S. 4 syllables, a noun. And it means to perceive quickly an explanation, critical analysis, or interpretation of a word or a literary passage. So we're going to take this article and we're going to exegesis it.
Terrific.
I'm going to partake some wisdom as you read the quotes.
Okay.
I'm going to exegesis on this stuff. And we might do some exegetical words on it. And you might even get a little bit of exegetically.
You should be excited today. We're doing American history.
Oh, I know. Yes, I should. But that means so many different things. And so many people want to look at it and say, well, it means this and this only. And
you mean it can have more than one meaning?
That's not the way you study history. Right.
Okay.
Unfortunately, though, in this country, that's the way most people study history, or they think you should study history. And therefore, that's why we have a problem with history, because people said, well, this is the way it was.
Is history an accounting of answers or an accounting of questions?
I think it is a study of how people dealt with issues within their time period and framework with the laws and norms that they were given. And we have to understand that depending on what you're reading, you generally only get one side of the question, or one side of the issue, or one side of the events. And people say, well, what do you mean? This happened. Well, there's your version of the story, there's my version of the story, and the truth is probably somewhere in between. For example, when English Americans or the English moved west, we read about their problems with the Indians, and the history book tells you how Daniel Boone and George Washington and all these people overcame the Indians. Did we talk to the Indians and ask what they felt and what their interpretation of was that happened? Is that in the book that you're reading? Whoa, what do you mean? Well, again, they might have a different perspective or different answers for us if we talk to them. And we don't do that. The old phrase, history is written by the winners.
Well, we celebrated July 4th recently, right, Lance? Which is the day that we've chosen as the day to mark independence.
Even though the independence took place on July 2nd, and again, people's minds are blown, right? What? Because I remember when I teach that in my history class. No, it's July 4th. That's when we celebrate. Okay, but they signed it on July 2nd. Okay, they came to an agreement on July 2nd.
Yes, they unanimously adopted a resolution stating that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. And it wasn't until 2 days later, after further debate, that the Declaration of Independence was approved. But the unanimous adoption of the resolution was July 2nd. So, but nevertheless, we celebrated July 4th recently. And here's from the article. When Americans commemorate the independence that Americans claimed in July 1776, some 246 years ago, we think little about the political decision that inspired John Adams and much more about the egalitarian language that Thomas Jefferson placed in the preamble of the Declaration. Like previous generations, we are still wrestling with the meaning of that language. What has changed is the readiness that many Americans now express to banish Jefferson from the discussion of equality because of his obvious sins against his own declared principles. But how well do we understand what Jefferson took those principles to mean? And how should his views in turn affect our perception of Jefferson himself? I think the article also makes a good point, Lance, as it continues on from there about how many Americans today can really tell you about why we claimed independence, what drove us to the long list of grievances against the British Crown. And therefore, what does that tell us about the lofty language that perhaps was used in our Declaration, but necessarily what was the motivation of that language?
Well, the answer is very few. Because if they studied it for a week or so. And in the case of our local school district, they study it for 15 weeks during their 8th grade year in school. And that is everything from Columbus coming to the New World through and finishing the Civil War in 16 weeks. So how much time is spent on revolutionary American history and the Declaration of Independence? Very little, because they have so much that they have to cover. So, the answer is most people don't. They know what their elementary school teacher taught them, who may or may not be a historian because of their licensing. They didn't have to take multiple history classes to get that. And that's no fault of theirs. That's not what they're supposed to do. But what we have then are people making statements and standing behind them and waving flags saying this is what the founding fathers said and did, without putting in perspective, as you point out, the number of factors that were going into the decision and the language that was chosen and what the interpretation of that language meant to each individual who was at the convention.
The author of this review piece contends the purpose of the Declaration was not to commit Americans forever after to pursuing the principle of individual equality as we now understand it. That was not the issue confronting the American revolutionaries in 1776, nor the reason why independence was proclaimed. The real purpose of the Declaration was to assert that Americans collectively were entitled to exercise the same rights of self-government as other peoples. The committee framing the Articles of Confederation would give this new people their political identity, and the potential Treaty of Alliance would enable them to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. This was the context within which the Declaration was drafted. Because there was no prospect of any negotiations or accommodation with Britain, the time had come to sever the last formal link uniting the colonies in the British Empire. If anything, he was doing his best to enforce the British Constitution, which made Parliament the supreme legislature throughout the empire.
That's the king.
Yes. But Americans had long denied that Parliament was empowered to enact laws binding the colonists. For the king to keep sustaining that claim was the equivalent to denying Americans the right of self-government.
Yeah, that was one of the main points, right? In that England and Parliament and the king said any British subject, which means people living in England or any of Great Britain's multitude of colonies, right? Because there were only there were more than 13 British colonies.
It was just the 13
in the New World.
Yeah.
And those were all following British law. And the king and Parliament are throwing up their hands like, what do you 13 have a problem with? The majority of our colonies in the New World have no problem with what we're doing. They understand they're British citizens and they're guided by Parliament and British law, and they're obeying it and don't have a problem with it. Why are you 13 having such a problem with this? And the 13 said, well, you know what? We don't feel like, because we are over here, that we should be subjugated to the same laws as British citizens in England, or for that matter, any of the other colonies. But they were focusing on England. And see, here's where I think King and Parliament missed the boat. And I've said this, why not just give them 3 or 4 voting members? Give the colonists 3 or 4 voting members in Parliament.
Oh, hindsight's 2020.
Because
right?
that took away. No, it's a problem solving, right? They could have done it then. But no, because it's about power. We're Parliament. We're the rulers of England. You are British royal subjects. You will obey us. And then it was like, well, no, we're not going to, because for all those things, Jefferson's language there that he used to so eloquently state that, no, we don't think we have to, and we don't think we should, and we're not going to.
Because really what many of them wanted originally, I mean, the Continental Congress, obviously, as people remember, developed over time and years. It's not like they woke up one day and now all of a sudden we've decided that, we all agree, and we've always agreed that this is the direction we want to go. That's not really how it happened. And I think understanding that many of them set out with the intention of saying, look, we're not even here to rebel per se and become our own country. We're here to get the government we already have to bestow us the rights that we believe our current British Constitution guarantees us.
Exactly. And you have Letters from the American Farmer by John Dickinson from Pennsylvania, who was part of the Constitutional Convention and the Declaration of Independence. He was a part of that whole process, who said, we need olive branches. We need to get along with England. We will all do better, but we just want some of these concessions. And the king said, no.
Like representation.
Right. And the king and Parliament said, no, we're not going to make any concessions. And they pushed people who were just asking for something that wasn't that big. They pushed them up against the wall to where they were pushing them back in the corner. And they came out and said, well, we don't have any other choice now than to break away with you, because what we are asking is just we think very normal and not a hard thing to do. And we still want to be loyal British subjects. We just want to be represented. And King and Parliament said, no, it's not the way it's going to work.
So a little history lesson, but what does that mean about how we judge someone like Jefferson, right? He proposes these ideas of great equality, of notions that all men are created equal, right? So, but then he also owns slaves. And in fact, in several places and in the original draft of the Constitution, takes a pretty harsh stand and blames Britain for slavery. But those, as we know, don't make it into the final draft of the Declaration. And the fact that they were in there originally, does that change anything at all about the acts of Thomas Jefferson and how we should view them? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. Even if Jefferson and his congressional colleagues had more explicit political purposes in mind, they too sensed that the appeal to equality had other meanings. The best evidence for this lies in the most significant deletion that Congress made in the draft of the Declaration submitted by Jefferson and his committee. This involved the last, lengthiest, and most impassioned of the 17, quote, repeated injuries and usurpations, comprising Jefferson's original indictment of George III. The final charge placed nearly the entire blame for the existence of plantation slavery on the British monarchy, while further accusing George III of seeking to foment a murderous slave rebellion against the free white population. Jefferson opened his remarkable passage by asserting that the king, quote, has waged war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty by captivating and carrying Africans into slavery in another hemisphere, or exposing them to miserable death in the horrific voyage we now call the Middle Passage. When someone of the American colonies had tried to limit the slave trade, the king had, quote, prostituted his negative, quote, his power to veto colonial legislation to preserve this execrable commerce. And now, to compound this assemblage of horrors, his subordinates in America were inviting the enslaved to rise up against their masters, murdering the people upon whom they also obtruded them, gaining their liberty by destroying the lives of their owners. Now, obviously, the article goes on to point out that there are certainly conveniences here, and the notion that American colonists were unwilling participants in the slave trade is certainly a exaggeration, and that again, this is Lance's, in my mind, the two sides to every, at least two sides to every story. The British sides of the story was, again, as Lance pointed out in the first segment, we have a constitution, we have laws, and you are a colony. And a colony is not entitled to the same rights as the mainland or other countries that are part of the kingdom. You are simply colonies. And we have many other colonies who are obeying the laws and doing as they're told, and you are trying to usurp our constitution. So my job as king and leader of this is to put down that insurrection and to remind you of your obligation to us, Now, we don't have to agree with that, but I think the other, important note is that the main part of the mainland of the United Kingdom outlawed slavery before the United States did. Now, it was still legal in colonies for quite some time because they wanted to benefit from the trade, which is part of what Jefferson is levying here against them, is saying that, you're saying one thing but doing another. But they got rid of slavery before we did. So I think it's also worth noting that while yes, there may be some truth to what Jefferson said, the other reason it was deleted is because there were colonies that didn't agree with that, right?
Well, and the point of today's discussion is about Jefferson. So here is Jefferson, who is in modern times, we'll get into that in the next segment, but in modern times maybe taking a hit because of what he stood for. And as the writer of the Declaration of Independence, he put this in, right? He thought enough about it to say, this is these are reasons why we have the right to, be independent and declare that we want to self-govern is because of things like this. And he put that in there to argue for the reason why the colonies should have the right to set up their own government and break away from England. So is it fair to bash on Jefferson when he's the one who put this in? He wasn't the one who wanted to take it out. It was the representatives from South Carolina, supported by the representatives from Georgia, who said, basically 11 of the 13 agreed, and South Carolina and Georgia said, we're not agreeing unless you take this one out. And Adams, all eyes, this is played out really well, by the way, on a musical entitled 1776. It was on the 4th of July, and I watched it, as I do most years, if I remember, to look on TCM and find it. And it's played out where the representatives look at John Adams, and say, what are you going to do, John? Here it is. You have the right to create a government. Okay. You get everything you want except this slavery issue. And Adams looks at Jefferson and says, in the musical, Adams, whether this is the way it played out or not, I don't know. But Adams looks at Jefferson and says, well, you wrote it. What are you going to do? And Jefferson very, flamboyantly walks up, and the document's laying on the front table, and he takes the quill pen on the table and he marks through it, making the point that it's better I believe in this. I wrote this. I believe in it. But the bigger issue here is that we want the right to self-govern. And I don't want to let anything get in the way of that. Had Adams stood his ground and said, no, we're not going to take it out, South Carolina and Georgia both would have voted no, and the United States of America would have never been created. But back to Jefferson, Jefferson wrote it, right? Jefferson put it in there. So is Jefferson a bad person? He's the one who wrote it and said, let's just, use this as a reason why we want to self-govern. And in doing that, we have maybe it would have had the discussion of ending slavery, to your point, a lot earlier, because the British government in England had already outlawed slavery. So was Jefferson moving everybody forward? And it was those people in South Carolina and Georgia who were holding him back?
I think part of probably the biggest indictment, right, against Jefferson is that despite the fact that in multiple places you can find writings where he basically, claims slavery to be a bad thing, in one form or another, he obviously continued to own slaves. And he made, by modern standards, many racist remarks. However, he also conceded in a number of places that those remarks were probably on shaky ground because it was very hard to judge a race of people who had been so oppressed by another race and say that, well, they're dumb or they're stupid or whatever. Well, okay, but they're not getting education, right? They don't have free will and determination. You're keeping them malnourished a lot of the time. You're working them to death. Like, is it really reasonable to expect them to be, a statesman like you if they don't have any of those opportunities? And of course, that's where part of I think the challenge for people comes in is how can you say these things if you really meant them? Why did you continue to own slaves? And I think part of that is Jefferson was a human, right?
You mean nobody's life is full of hypocrisies? Where all these people that are bashing on Jefferson have no hypocrisy in their life whatsoever. They're very learned, very well spoken, and they don't have conflicting comments and opinions at different times in their lives. They haven't said things that go against what they've said earlier. Really? I mean, I have a hard time with that. Okay. It's really, in the Bible, right? I think it says, and again, you always check on me because you always make sure, no, that's not really not in there, but doesn't it say ye without sin cast the first stone? Right. Are those of people out there who are bashing on the beliefs of our forefathers 200 years ago? Are they perfect? Have they not done things that are incongruent and don't make sense at points in their life, and have opinions that are conflicting at times? I think that's just, as you point out, that's being human. Is the bigger question is it fair for 200 years of evolution and revolution of ideas to then put those morals and values on people from 200 years ago? Because if you say, well, yes, it is, then what are people 200 years from now going to do to us? If you think everybody 200 years from now is going to believe what we believe, what these morally righteous people believe now, if you think that's going to be the case in 200 years, that people are still believing that, I honorably disagree with you that will be the case. So I think we need to be careful when we put our values and judgment and our knowledge and our learning on people from previous generations.
Part of the challenge, I think, is people's ability, and we've talked about this before, to accept the nuance, right? Can we say that it's terrible that Jefferson owned slaves and allowed slavery to continue through his lifetime? Sure. And it is. I wish that he had not. There were certainly people at his time who did not do that and who fought to make people free, so saying that there wasn't anybody doing that or that it was impossible. No, that's not true. He could have done more and he didn't. And that's too bad, and that's terrible. I mean, it's awful, obviously, for the people that were slaves. He was, by many measures, and this doesn't make it right, a fairly benevolent slaveholder in comparison to many others who had slaves. Does that make it good? No, because slavery is still bad. At the same time, does the fact that he owned slaves, the fact that he didn't do more, does that then mitigate the many benefits that he brought to society, not the least of which is the authoring of the Declaration of Independence and the authoring and substantial contributions to the Virginia Constitution, and, by the way, helping create and mastermind the first public education system in the country? That doesn't mean that those things make it okay that he had slaves, right? But just like the fact that he had slaves doesn't invalidate those things as good. And I guess that's part of the problem that Lance and I feel like have talked about a lot, is both can be true, right? It can be morally detestable that he had slaves and didn't do more. It can also be worth studying and recognizing the many great things he did do for his country. Because, as Lance said, right, we all have mistakes and sins. Hopefully, most of us do not have sins on the level of holding people in slavery. But there are plenty of things that we all do all the time that contradict what we say or what we supposedly stand for when it's convenient for us to do so. And Jefferson liked wealth, and he liked money, and he liked wine, and he liked art, and he liked to have and buy things and design and build. And all of that required a lot of money. And he made money how? With his plantation, as many people did.
Well, the way it was set up in the economy during his lifetime.
Where he was raised, what he inherited from his family, those many things. There were, though, and I think that's, again, in fairness, there were other people who made livings other ways, and there were people who didn't have slaves, But even the people that didn't have slaves, you could contend, like, for example, John Adams, were in fact complacent in such actions because they had, as we talked about, opportunities to push harder on the issue when they did not. But let's continue to talk about it. And what did Jefferson say about any of this? I wonder, did he say anything about how he felt about future generations' judgments and laws and how we should view others? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. March 27th, 1789, Thomas Jefferson writes to James Madison. This is a long letter about the question, as Jefferson says, whether one generation of men has right to bind another seems never to have been started either on this or our side of the water. Yet it is such a question of such consequence as not only to merit decision, but also among the fundamental principles of every government. Then we skip ahead several paragraphs, and he says, on similar ground, it may be proved that no society can make a perpetual constitution or even a perpetual law. The earth belongs always to the living generation. They may manage it then, and what proceeds from it as they please, during their usufruct. They are masters too of their own persons, and consequently may govern them as they please. But persons and property make the sum of the objects of government. The Constitution and the laws of their predecessors extinguished then in their natural course with those who gave them being. This could preserve that being till it ceased to be itself and no longer. Every constitution then, and every law, naturally expires at the end of 19 years. That was his justification at the time. If it be enforced longer, it is an act of force, not of right. It may be said that the succeeding generation exercises in fact the power of repeal. This leaves them as free as if the Constitution or law had been expressly limited to 19 years only. In the first place, this objection admits the right in proposing an equivalent, but the power of repeal is not an equivalent. It might be indeed if every form of government were so perfectly contrived that the will of the majority could always be obtained fairly and without impediment. But this is true of no form. The people cannot assemble themselves. Their representation is unequal and vicious. Various checks are opposed to every legislative proposition. Factions get possession of the public councils. Bribery corrupts them. Personal interests lead them astray from the general interest of their constituents, and other impediments arise so as to prove to every practical man that a law of limited duration is much more manageable than one which needs a repeal.
Okay, me not being a really strong auditory learner, what'd you just say?
What did all that mean? Well, what it meant was, I think, that Jefferson is basically saying the earth belongs to the living, and that the living decides the laws and the lay of the land. And in fact, if you paid attention closely, he suggested that no society should ever make a perpetual constitution or even a perpetual law.
Because people's opinions and ideas and life and the world changes, and the next generation should have the right to decide how they want to live, right? Is that kind of what we're doing there?
That's what I think.
Okay.
Not being a very learned person myself.
So Jefferson was saying that here's what we thought, but it's unfair to tell other people to follow what we thought, because they've become more learned. They have their own ideas, and they should make their own world the way that they see fit. And therefore, they shouldn't judge us for what we did, because we did with what we had the best we could. So my point is, you don't put values on someone from years and years ago is inherently unfair. If you want to do it, that's fine. But understand, people are going to do it to you in the future. I mean, it's not unlike many people listen to me on this podcast and they say, well, there's the old white man talking again. They're already judging what I say and what I do, okay, and saying that, well, because of this, this, and this, we're just not even going to pay any attention to them because we know what those old white men do. And that's what Jefferson's saying is like, you know, be careful what you say about previous generations, you know, because they're going to say the same thing about you. So is Jefferson a great guy? I think he did a lot. I mean, he did a lot of wonderful things. Did he do some bad things? Yes, he did. Okay, so now what? I mean, I'm asking questions, right? I mean, and that's what I think. And I said that at the beginning of the show. That's what I think history is. It's answering questions. Why did people do the things they did? Okay, at that time. But I think you also need to bring in the other side of things, which you've tried to do today. But so Jefferson is a complex individual. He did a lot of wonderful things that we still use today, and we have used through the history of our country to further us and give us all of the freedoms and the things that we have today. He also did some things that we don't think would have been right had we been alive at that time. Does that make him an evil person? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it makes him a human, like you said in the last segment. It makes him human. Okay? These aren't demigods. They never said they were demigods. They never said they were perfect. Okay? And that's part of the problem when we study history in this country, is we want to say, well, these people, they were better than we were. And we have to hold them up and their ideals. And then so now when we do that, then people feel the need to tear them down. Why can't we just say they did some good things and they did some bad things when they were in power? And these are the good things they did. And these are the reasons why we think they're good. And these are the bad things they did. And these are the reasons why we think it's bad. And now, what does that mean for you as an American today? Well, can you try to do more of the good things that they did and stay away from some of the bad things that they did? Because if you do that, and I do that, and we all try to do that, then we can make America a better place. That's why we study history. This is what these people did with the set of circumstances they were given. Here are the good things they did. Let's try to embellish those and work on those and do more of those good things. Well, here are the things that we think they did that weren't so good. Let's try not to do those things. Let's try not to put our values on other people. Because that's what slavery was. Slavery was, well, this was my value, and I'm going to put this on other people. And by God, you have to live by my values because my values are right. Well, I'm not Thomas Jefferson. I don't own slaves. No, but you tell people that they have to live on the values and the morals that you believe in.
Is Thomas Jefferson a great person? I haven't decided that yet. And I think we all could enjoy the opportunity to say that what our founders deserve is a genuine study of who they were, what they did, and to what we understand about why they did it. And that last one's important because despite what we have access to, what we can read, what historians will tell you, they're all gone, right? And it's not like we can ask them why they did what they did. And even what they wrote down, they may not be fully aware of. And that's not an excuse, justification. It's just a reality of people that have been gone for 200 plus years. We should study them. We should learn from them. To erase them would be foolish. They asked many questions that we still struggle with today, and in many ways they came up with different answers. Sometimes they came up with answers that we still live by today. Can they be bad and good? Yes, I think so, because I think that Generally, most people fit into that category. We all have weaknesses. We all have strengths. Some of us have more weaknesses than strengths. Some of us more strengths than weaknesses. And it's just a measure of determining that. But the founders were very sensitive. And I think sensitive to the fact of judgment by future generations. Adam said, and we've quoted this once before, posterity, you will never know how much it cost the present generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make a good use of it. If you do not, I shall repent in heaven that I ever took half the pains to preserve it. What's Adam saying there, Lance?
I don't know. You tell me.
You don't know?
No, I was zoning out thinking of my closing.
I think he's saying that future generations can never know the pains that they went to give us freedom. And that doesn't make them better or worse than us. It's just to simply say that you can't understand what it cost us. So don't try to. Instead, focus on making the country better. Focus on moving forward. Because that's really what we were trying to do, right? Is set it up so that future generations wouldn't go through what we went through.
And that's what I was thinking about. You know, the founding fathers enabled us to do this show, right? We ask questions and we want to have a conversation because that's our mission here at True Chat, is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And that's what we're having today. And you don't have to agree with us. Matter of fact, we don't necessarily want you to agree with us. We've thrown some things out there and we want to have that conversation because we want the common goal to make things better for everybody. Okay. You can't have that, as Jefferson and Adams felt, by somebody dictating from on high what you're going to do. They said, we need to have that power ourselves through discussions and rhetoric and what we think is best. And that's all we're doing here on this show, is sharing these opinions and these thoughts so that we can have a discussion with the ultimate goal of making where we live a better place when we leave than it was when we found it. Tell your families and friends about us. Tell them if they like the show, like the idea, the concept. They can listen to us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is available Tuesdays and Thursdays as a podcast first thing in the mornings. We're also heard on the weekends on AM and FM radio stations around the country. I don't know. Do we even have a winner today, Lance?
Oh, no, I thought I won
okay.
I did a lot more exegesing than you did.
If there's no clear winner, then Lance wins.
Exactly.
I got it. Okay. I see. For the State of Us on True Chat,
it's my game, my rules.
I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Everybody knows whose game it really is, and that's our producer, Bradley Butch. Thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.